$400,000. That was the figure typed in stark, officious calibri on the violation notice. A sum so ludicrous, it almost looped back around to comedy. Almost. The subject line: unauthorized agricultural machinery and associated environmental impact fees. My harvester. They'd fined me $400,000 for my harvester, currently sitting silent, but menacingly so, in their eyes, on my own damn farm. My land, deeded, paid for, worked by my family for 3 generations, apparently now subject to the aesthetic whims and fabricated ecological concerns of the Creekwood Estates Homeowners Association, a gaggle of sun-starved busybodies, whose domain officially ended a good quarter-mile from my property line. Their latest edict, delivered with the smug finality only a petty tyrant, armed with a 3-ring binder of bylaws can muster, was an ultimatum. Remove the offending John Deere 780, an admittedly colossal piece of precision engineering designed for one purpose, efficiently separating grain from chaff, life from stalk, or face further, unspecified, punitive measures. The notice was signed by one Mildred McMillan, HOA president, a woman whose primary contribution to the world seemed to be the aggressive beigeification of Creekwood Estates and the persecution of anyone who dared display a non-regulation garden gnome. The petty harassment had been a slow burn, a war of 1,000 paper cuts. Letters about the unseemly height of my corn stalks, despite them being on agricultural zoned land. Complaints about the olfactory disturbance of manure, a scent I considered the perfume of productivity, timed with the precision of a sniper right before my daughter's outdoor birthday party. They'd even tried to dictate the color I could paint my barn, a structure older than their entire subdivision by a century. Each missive was met with my polite, legally reviewed, carefully worded declination to comply with their overreach. I'd hoped, naively, that reason, or perhaps boredom, would eventually prevail. But Mildred was not a creature of reason. She was fueled by a potent cocktail of entitlement and a desperate need for control, a suburban Napoleon gazing out from her meticulously HOA-approved bay window, dreaming of new territories to conquer. This, however, this $400,000 love letter regarding my harvester, this was different. This wasn't a paper cut. This was an attempt to sever an artery. My family, my wife Sarah, my son Tom, they were my anchor, the calm eye in the storm of my otherwise intensely focused existence. Sarah's hand found mine that evening, her touch a silent question, her eyes reflecting the absurdity and the nascent threat. "They can't be serious, can they?" she whispered, the crinkle of the official paper loud in the quiet kitchen. I looked at the document, the way the ink seemed to bleed malice, a zoom in on the arrogance of that signature. "Oh, I think she's deadly serious," I replied, my voice devoid of inflection. But a cold resolve, hard and sharp as obsidian, was already forming. They didn't know who I was, not really. They saw a farmer, a man who worked the soil. They didn't see the meticulous mind, the one that planned crop rotations like campaigns, that understood logistics and pressure points with an almost preternatural clarity. They had mistaken quiet for quiescent. They had mistaken patience for weakness. This wasn't just about a fine or a piece of machinery. This was about my land, my livelihood, my legacy. And Mildred McMillan had just declared war. The moral violation, when it came, was swift and executed with a chilling bureaucratic efficiency that spoke volumes of Mildred McMillan's dedication to her petty fiefdom. 2 days after the initial $400,000 fine notice, a period during which I had, of course, lodged a formal, legally backed dispute citing jurisdictional boundaries and agricultural zoning protections, a flatbed tow truck, accompanied by 2 smug HOA enforcement officers, Gary and Chet, both possessing the kind of physique that suggested their primary form of exertion was lifting a donut to their lips. And Mildred herself arrived at the edge of my farm. She stood there, arms crossed, a vision in a power pink pantsuit that clashed violently with the earthy tones of my land, her face a mask of triumphant vindictiveness. "Mr. Henderson," she called out, her voice carrying the reedy authority of someone unused to being ignored, as per paragraph 7, subsection D, of the Creekwood Estates Covenant Addendum regarding adjacent property nuisances. Your failure to remit payment or remove the proscribed heavy machinery has resulted in its immediate impoundment. Confiscated. They were actually going to try and take my harvester. My new 10-ton, $500,000 harvester, the key to bringing in the corn, soy, and wheat that formed the backbone of my operation. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. I walked towards them, slowly, deliberately, my boots crunching on the gravel path I'd laid myself. Sarah watched from the porch, her face pale. Tom standing beside her, his young eyes wide with a mixture of fear and indignation. This was the line. They had crossed it with jackboots and a tow truck. "Mildred," I said, my voice low and calm, a counterpoint to her shrill pronouncements. "This vehicle is on my private property. Your HOA has zero jurisdiction here. This is theft, pure and simple." Her laugh was a brittle thing. "Oh, I think you'll find the revised bylaws, ratified last Tuesday, are quite clear, Mr. Henderson. We have a lien. The harvester will be held until the fine and all associated recovery costs are paid in full." She brandished another sheaf of papers, no doubt more of her self-serving legal fictions. Gary and Chet, emboldened by her presence, began to unhitch chains from the flatbed. The visual was stark, their flimsy tow rig against the backdrop of my sprawling fields, the gleaming yellow and green of the harvester, a defiant monument to agricultural might. It was like watching ants try to carry away a sleeping lion. I could have stopped them, physically. I knew every inch of this land, every advantage it offered. But a physical confrontation was what she wanted. A scene. A confirmation of her narrative that I was the unreasonable, aggressive party. No. My retaliation would be surgical, precise, and utterly devastating, conducted on a battlefield of her own choosing, but with weapons she couldn't even comprehend. I let them take it. The metallic shriek of the winch, the groan of the harvester's massive tires being dragged, the triumphant smirk on Mildred's face as the truck pulled away. Each sensation burned itself into my memory. It was a dramatic, almost theatrical act of injustice, the stage lights provided by the harsh midday sun. As the flatbed rumbled down the county road, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled like a shroud over my initial shock, I felt a cold, implacable fury solidify within me. It wasn't the hot, explosive anger she likely expected. It was something far more dangerous, a cold-blooded calm, an absolute certainty of purpose. They hadn't just confiscated a piece of machinery, they had confiscated my patience. They had triggered a protocol I hadn't needed to access for years. They had, in essence, signed their own eviction notice from the comfortable, well-fed world they took for granted. The blood, metaphorically speaking, was now on Mildred's hands. What Mildred McMillan, in her infinite, power-suited wisdom, didn't know, what none of them, in their pristine, manicured cul-de-sacs, with their identical, HOA-approved mailboxes knew, was the intricate, almost invisible web that connected their daily bread, their organic kale, their free-range eggs, directly back to me. Their artisanal bakery, the Daily Need? Its primary flour supplier was a mill that bought 70% of its specialty wheat from my farm. The Farm Fresh Organics Co-op that supplied their weekly vegetable boxes? My land yielded a significant portion of their heirloom tomatoes, sweet corn, and leafy greens, especially the early and late-season varieties that commanded premium prices. Even Boutique Bovine, the high-end butcher providing their grass-fed, ethically raised beef, sourced a considerable amount of its winter feed, custom-blended hay and silage, from my surplus crops. I didn't just own a farm. I was a critical, albeit unacknowledged, linchpin in their entire local food supply chain. They had fined me for the very harvester that ensured the timely planting and harvesting of the crops that filled their pantries and graced their dinner tables. They had confiscated the tool of their own sustenance. The irony was so thick you could spread it on toast, if they were going to have any toast left to spread it on. My first call wasn't to my lawyer, not yet. It was to a man I'll call Badger. Badger was a curiosity, a former agricultural logistics savant who'd cashed out early and now spent his days dabbling in ethical hacking, conspiracy theories, some more plausible than others, and maintaining a network of contacts that would make a spy agency blush. He owed me a significant favor from years back, a delicate matter involving a misdirected shipment of rare orchid bulbs and a very angry South American cartel. He answered on the first ring. "Henderson." His voice crackled, tinny and conspiratorial. "To what do I owe the dubious honor? Don't tell me the genetically modified squirrels are back." I bypassed the pleasantries. "Mildred McMillan, Creekwood Estates, HOA. They just confiscated my 780. Hello whistle. Bold. Stupidly bold. What's the play?" "Operation Empty Pantry," I said, the name forming itself in my mind with a grim satisfaction. "I need a full breakdown of every foodstuff, every supplier, every distributor that services Creekwood Estates. And I need to know every single connection, direct or indirect, that traces back to Henderson Farms." Badger chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Consider it a symphony of spreadsheets, my friend. They poked the bear. Now the bear pokes back, right in the breadbasket." While Badger began his digital deep dive, I retreated to my study, the one place Sarah knew to leave me undisturbed when the gears were truly grinding. On the large oak desk, I unrolled blueprints, not of buildings, but of my farm, my irrigation systems, my planting schedules. I began to sketch out a new kind of map, one overlaid with delivery routes, wholesale agreements, and expiration dates. This wasn't just about stopping the flow. It was about controlled, precise disruption. It was about demonstrating with surgical precision the consequences of arrogance. The visual of those supply chain maps, branching out from my land like the roots of a great tree, then converging on the small, isolated island of Creekwood Estates, was potent. It was a reminder that no community, no matter how insulated by its own rules and delusions, is truly an island. Mildred thought she was enforcing a boundary. She was about to find out she'd merely highlighted her own critical vulnerability. My plan wasn't just about revenge. It was about re-education, a practical lesson in cause and effect, delivered one empty shelf at a time. The intelligence-gathering phase began with a meticulousness that would have impressed a seasoned military strategist. Badger, true to his word, delivered a digital dossier within 24 hours that was a masterpiece of interconnected data. It was all there. Shipping manifests, wholesale invoices encrypted with digital signatures, even leaked email chains from local grocery managers discussing supplier reliability. He'd cross-referenced everything with property records, business licenses, and even, somewhat alarmingly, the social media boasts of Creekwood residents about their favorite local brands. It turned out my farm's tendrils reached even further into their curated lifestyles than I'd initially suspected. The artisanal cheese they favored, the dairy sourced its prized alfalfa from my western fields. The microbrewery whose IPA was the drink of choice at their tedious summer barbecues? My specialty barley was a key ingredient. It was a target-rich environment. My next step was to consult with Arthur Jenkins, my lawyer. Arthur was old school, a man whose office smelled of aged paper and justice, his suits impeccably tailored, his demeanor one of somber resilience. He listened without interruption as I laid out the HOA's actions, the illegal seizure of my harvester, the fraudulent fine, and my burgeoning plan for recalibration. He didn't flinch. Instead, a slow, wolfish grin spread across his face, a sight more terrifying than any overt display of anger. "Malicious interference with commerce," he purred, steepling his fingers. "Unlawful conversion of property, defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, especially concerning the impact on your family. Oh, Mildred McMillan has been a very busy little beaver, hasn't she? Building dams where there's no water." We began to assemble the legal counteroffensive. Arthur advised a two-pronged approach. First, an immediate injunction to force the return of the harvester and a stay on the fine, backed by irrefutable proof of their lack of jurisdiction. Second, a much larger civil suit for damages, one that would target not just the HOA as an entity, but Mildred McMillan personally, citing abuse of power and demonstrable financial harm. "We'll need to document everything," Arthur cautioned, his eyes glinting. "Every lost hour of productivity due to the harvester's absence, every potential contract jeopardized, every sleepless night your wife has endured." While Arthur drafted the initial legal salvos, I began my own quiet reconnaissance. I drove through Creekwood Estates, a silent observer in my unremarkable pickup truck. I noted the meticulously manicured lawns, the identical mailboxes, the faint air of smug conformity. I saw Mildred McMillan herself, clipboard in hand, scrutinizing a resident's rose bushes with the intensity of a diamond cutter. She seemed oblivious, cocooned in her self-importance. I even had badgers set up a discreet perimeter surveillance, nothing illegal, just monitoring publicly accessible HOA meeting minutes, online forums where residents griped, often about Mildred, and tracking the movements of the tow truck company that had taken my harvester. The information was fuel. Each new piece of data, each photograph of Mildred's imperious patrols, each scanned copy of an overreaching HOA communique added to the cold fire within me. On-screen text in my mind's eye. Violation notice, confiscation order, legal complaint draft. The transition was from victim to architect of consequence. My internal monologue was a steady rhythm of tactical planning. Phase 1. Secure the asset. Phase 2. Isolate the threat. Phase 3. Dismantle the power structure. The fight for my harvester was just the opening skirmish. The real war was for the soul of common sense, and Mildred was the general of the opposing and deeply deluded army. Phase 1 of Operation Empty Pantry commenced not with a bang, but with a whisper, a subtle tightening of the agricultural tap. It began with the specialty orders, the niche products that Creekwood residents prided themselves on sourcing. The first casualty was the artisanal bakery, the Daily Need. My usual shipment of high-protein marquee wheat, the kind that gave their sourdough its distinctive chew and their baguettes their perfect crust, was suddenly delayed due to unforeseen mechanical issues at the mill. The mill, of course, was acting on my discreet and perfectly legal request to prioritize other clients for a short period. The owner, a pragmatic man named Henderson, no relation, amusingly, but an ally nonetheless, after I'd helped him out of a bind with a contaminated grain silo years ago, understood the delicate dance of commerce and obligation. He owed me a favor. I was merely calling it in with a plausible cover story. Within a week, the sold-out signs for their signature loaves started appearing earlier and earlier in the day. Next, I had a quiet word with the manager of the Farm Fresh Organics Co-op. I explained with deep regret that an unexpected pest issue, purely hypothetical of course, meant my usual bumper crop of early-season heirloom tomatoes and sweet peppers would be significantly reduced. I could only fulfill a fraction of their standing order. Alternative local sources for such early-season quality? Scarce. The impact was less immediate but insidious. The vibrant displays in their produce section began to look a little sparser, a little less premium. The whispers started then, faint at first, in the checkout lines and on the Creekwood Community Facebook page. Did you manage to get any of the Daily Needs rustic white today? Farm Fresh seems a bit thin on the ground with the good tomatoes, doesn't it? Mildred McMillan, naturally, remained blissfully ignorant of these subtle shifts in the culinary landscape. She was far too busy. I saw her myself, during one of my reconnaissance drives, measuring the height of a resident's ornamental grass with a retractable tape measure, her expression one of grave concern. The HOA had just issued a new set of regulations regarding the approved Pantone shades for exterior window shutters. The absurdity was a constant, low hum beneath the growing tension. My inner monologue was laced with a dry, deadpan sarcasm. They're worried about the precise taupe of their trim while their access to fresh ciabatta is quietly being throttled. The visual metaphor was clear. Mildred obsessing over the crumbs while the entire cake was about to vanish. The beauty of this initial squeeze was its deniability. These were everyday agricultural hiccups, plausible issues that could happen to any supplier. There was no direct line back to me, nothing Mildred's little enforcers could pin down. But I knew. And as I monitored Badger's aggregated reports of online chatter and supply chain disruptions, I felt a grim satisfaction. The chess pieces were moving. The board was being set. The first soft taps on the walls of their insulated little world were being felt. They hadn't even realized the siege had begun. My harvester still sat in their impound lot, a monument to their arrogance. But now, it was also a ticking clock, counting down to a much larger, more personal reckoning. Each day it remained, there was another day their food supply chain subtly weakened, another thread unraveled. The pinch, initially a subtle discomfort, began to evolve into a palpable irritation within Creekwood Estates. The Farm Fresh Organics Co-op, once a beacon of bountiful produce, started displaying apologetic little signs. Due to unforeseen supplier challenges, some items may be temporarily unavailable. We apologize for the inconvenience. The inconvenience meant no local strawberries for the annual Creekwood Summer Fete Planning Committee, and the heirloom tomatoes essential for Ms. Periwinkle's prize-winning gazpacho were replaced by bland, hothouse imposters trucked in from out of state. Prices at the Daily Need, when they had bread at all, crept upwards, citing increased ingredient costs. Badger, my tech-savvy ally, reveled in his role as a digital agent provocateur. He frequented the Creekwood community forums under various pseudonyms: Concerned Resident 82, Lover of Local, Bring Back the Baggots, subtly stoking the embers of discontent. He'd post things like, "Anyone else notice the quality drop at Farm Fresh lately? Used to be so reliable," or "Heard a rumor the mill supplying Daily Need is having major issues." Shame, their multigrain was the best. He never accused, never pointed fingers directly, just planted seeds of doubt and amplified existing anxieties. Mildred McMillan, however, was not one for subtle analysis. Her response to the growing murmurs of dissatisfaction was typically ham-fisted. She called an emergency HOA community meeting. The flyer, printed on offensively bright yellow paper, proclaimed, "Urgent community update, addressing supply irregularities and upholding Creekwood standards." I decided to attend. It was important to observe the antagonist in her natural habitat, under pressure. The community clubhouse, usually reserved for bridge tournaments and awkward seasonal parties, was packed. The air was thick, with a miasma of anxiety and expensive perfume. Mildred stood at the podium, resplendent in a severe navy blue dress that screamed authority, or perhaps severe indigestion. "Residents," she began, her voice amplified by a crackling microphone, "it has come to my attention that certain disruptions have been experienced by some. Let me assure you, your HOA board is diligently investigating these external attempts to undermine our community's cohesion." She blamed unscrupulous out-of-area suppliers, nationwide logistical failures, and even hinted darkly at elements seeking to discredit Creekwood's reputation for excellence. Not once did she consider that the problem might be closer to home, specifically the giant confiscated harvester sitting in an impound lot, a direct consequence of her own hubris. I watched from the back, a silent observer, a ghost at their feast, or their increasingly meager snack. Her performance was a masterclass in deflection and delusion. She announced new initiatives, a preferred vendor program, vetted by her naturally, stricter enforcement of rules against non-sanctioned deliveries, a desperate attempt to control the narrative and the flow of goods, and a call for community vigilance against rumor-mongering. She even tried to ban residents from publicly discussing the shortages, claiming it created unnecessary panic. The visual was potent. Mildred, under the harsh fluorescent lights, her face tight with a mixture of fury and fear, railing against invisible enemies while the real architect of her woes watched, impassive. The split screen in my mind showed empty bakery shelves juxtaposed with her increasingly unhinged pronouncements. The neighbors, the silent majority, squirmed. They weren't openly rebellious yet, but the seeds of doubt were well and truly sown. They were starting to connect the dots between the HOA's iron fist and their suddenly problematic pantry. My harvester remained impounded. The fine remained ludicrous. But now, a new variable had entered their carefully controlled equation: hunger, or at least the distinct lack of artisanal sourdough. The legal assault, when it landed, was not a polite tap on the door but a tactical breach. Arthur Jenkins, my stoic legal warrior, filed the lawsuit with a flourish that belied his usually reserved demeanor. It wasn't just a counterclaim, it was a meticulously documented barrage, a legal broadside aimed squarely at the HOA's crumbling facade and, more specifically, at Mildred McMillan's personal assets. The charges were comprehensive: unlawful seizure of property, my harvester; malicious interference with business operations, my farm; defamation, their public statements about my non-compliance; gross negligence in the administration of the HOA; and, the cherry on top, a claim for significant punitive damages designed to make an example of them. The sum we sought was not arbitrary. It was calculated based on lost productivity, potential damage to the harvester from improper storage, damage to my professional reputation, and the considerable emotional distress inflicted upon my family. It dwarfed their ridiculous $400 fine by an order of magnitude. Simultaneously, Badger, my digital gremlin, executed his part of Phase 2. He compiled a neat package: copies of the original exorbitant fine, photos of my harvester being unceremoniously towed, select anonymous but verified complaints from Creekwood residents about Mildred's increasingly erratic behavior, and a summary of the burgeoning food supply issues, subtly hinting at a connection without explicitly stating it. This package found its way onto the desk of Brenda Carlucci, the most tenacious investigative reporter at the County Chronicle, a woman known for her ability to smell hypocrisy from 3 towns over. The hook was irresistible. Local OA fines farmer nearly $500,000 for harvester, now faces food shortages and massive lawsuit. The headline wrote itself. The narrative shift was immediate and seismic. Suddenly, the Creekwood HOA wasn't a quaint local governance body. It was a symbol of bureaucratic overreach, of petty tyranny with real-world consequences. Mildred McMillan wasn't just a stern enforcer of rules. She was portrayed as a delusional despot whose actions were harming not only a local farmer, but also her own constituents. News vans, previously an alien sight in the serene cul-de-sacs of Creekwood, began to appear. Brenda Carlucci, microphone in hand, was spotted attempting to interview residents, most of whom scurried away. But a few, emboldened by anonymity or sheer frustration, offered damning sound bites about rising prices, empty shelves, and Mildred's dictatorial style. Mildred, when cornered by Carlucci outside an emergency HOA board meeting, from which 2 members had already conspicuously resigned, looked flustered, her usual composure cracking. Her televised response was a masterclass in indignant denial, blaming sensationalist media and disgruntled individuals with personal vendettas. It didn't play well. The visual of her, sputtering and defensive, juxtaposed with shots of my idle fields and the impounded harvester, was devastating. Arthur Jenkins, meanwhile, presented a calm, authoritative counterpoint in his own brief press statement, simply outlining the facts of the case and expressing confidence in the legal process. He was the voice of reason against her escalating hysteria. A slow zoom in my mind's eye, not on documents this time, but on my own reflection. A flicker of something grim, yes, but also a profound sense of justification. The fight was public now. The tactical quiet of the initial squeeze was over. This was overt warfare, waged in the courts and in the court of public opinion. And Mildred, for all her carefully crafted bylaws and iron-fisted pronouncements, was woefully unprepared for a battle on this scale, against an opponent who understood that true power wasn't about loud commands, but about controlling the very ground beneath your enemy's feet, or in this case, the food on their table. The cracks in Mildred McMillan's meticulously constructed empire began to appear not as subtle fissures, but as yawning chasms. The lawsuit, coupled with the increasingly negative media attention and the very real decline in their quality of life, had emboldened the previously silent majority within Creekwood Estates. The first overt act of rebellion was small but significant. Mrs. Henderson, again no relation, but a kindred spirit in her love for vibrant flower beds, defiantly replanted the petunias Mildred had ordered removed for being a non-approved varietal. When Mildred confronted her, clipboard trembling, Mrs. Henderson simply smiled sweetly and offered her a glass of lemonade, which Mildred, sputtering, declined. The online community forum, once a place for polite inquiries about lost cats and recommendations for plumbers, became a hotbed of dissent. Badger, a master of digital nudging, didn't even need to intervene much anymore. The residents were doing it themselves. Threads titled, "Motion of No Confidence in President McMillan" and "Can we legally dissolve the HOA?" gained hundreds of replies. Several more HOA board members, sensing the shifting tides and perhaps fearing personal liability from our lawsuit, tendered their resignations via tersely worded emails, which were promptly leaked to Brenda Carlucci. Mildred became increasingly isolated. Her attempts to enforce rules were met with open defiance or, worse, outright mockery. When she tried to fine Mr. Abernathy for parking his vintage, and admittedly somewhat rusty, pickup truck in his own driveway, a clear violation of the No Unsightly Vehicles bylaw, he reportedly laughed, told her to add it to the Henderson tab, and then proceeded to wash and wax the offending vehicle with an almost theatrical flourish, drawing a small, appreciative crowd of neighbors. Her pronouncements at the hastily called, and poorly attended, emergency clarification meetings grew more desperate and conspiratorial. She blamed corporate agricultural espionage for the food shortages and accused affecting board members of being traitors to Creekwood values. The visual of her, alone at the podium, addressing a room of mostly empty chairs, was a poignant illustration of her dwindling power. The edifice of her petty tyranny was crumbling, not from a battering ram, but from the weight of its own absurdity and the quiet, relentless pressure I had applied. My inner monologue was one of cold satisfaction. She built her kingdom on bylaws of sand, enforced by fear. But fear cannot fill an empty stomach, nor can it intimidate a populace that has finally found its voice. The symbolic power of my confiscated harvester, still languishing in the impound lot, had transformed. It was no longer just a symbol of their overreach. It was now a monument to their spectacular misjudgment, a rusting testament to Mildred's folly, highlighted daily in the County Chronicle. The calls for its return, and for Mildred's resignation, were growing louder, echoing from the manicured lawns of Creekwood to the chambers of the local courthouse. The rules she had wielded like a weapon were now being systematically banned by popular sentiment, rendered unenforceable by a community that had finally had enough. The momentum was undeniable. Her reign was effectively over. All that remained was the final, public act of dethronement. The public reckoning arrived not in a courtroom, as initially anticipated, but at a specially convened town hall meeting, brokered by a beleaguered mayor eager to quell the Creekwood crisis that was now a recurring, embarrassing headline. The auditorium was packed to the rafters. Creekwood residents, concerned citizens from neighboring areas, a phalanx of local media, and, strategically positioned in the front row, my wife Sarah, my son Tom, and Arthur Jenkins, his expression one of serene, lawyerly expectation. Mildred McMillan sat alone at a long table on the stage, a single wilting pitcher of water her only companion. She looked smaller, diminished, the power pink pantsuit from the day of the harvester confiscation now seeming less a statement of authority and more a desperate clinging to a fading illusion. The mayor, a portly man named Wilkins, whose main talent was finding the middle ground even when none existed, opened with platitudes about community and dialogue. Then he turned the floor over to me. I walked to the podium, carrying no notes, only the weight of the past few weeks and the cold, hard facts. The room fell silent. "Good evening," I began, my voice calm, measured, amplified just enough by the microphone. "My name is John Henderson. I am a farmer. My family has worked the land just beyond Creekwood Estates for generations. We are your neighbors." I paused, letting that sink in. Several weeks ago, the Creekwood HOA, under the leadership of Ms. McMillan, levied a fine of $400,000 against my farm. The reason? My harvester. A machine essential for planting and bringing in the crops that, as it turns out, many of you rely upon. A murmur rippled through the crowd. They then unlawfully entered my private property and confiscated that harvester. I looked directly at Mildred. Her gaze skittered away. This act was not just an attack on my livelihood. It was an act of profound arrogance and breathtaking incompetence. You see, Miss McMillan, in your zeal to enforce your meticulously crafted but ultimately meaningless rules, you failed to understand a fundamental principle: interconnectedness. You banned the tool, unaware you were also, in effect, banning the food from your own tables. My monologue was precise, each word chosen with surgical care. I laid out the timeline, the illegalities, the direct consequences of her actions, the shortages, the price hikes, the anxiety she had inflicted on her own community. I spoke of the sleepless nights my wife endured, the confusion in my son's eyes. I didn't raise my voice. The facts themselves were damning enough. You fined me for ensuring your food supply. You confiscated the means of its production. You sought to control, to dominate, without understanding, without wisdom, without a shred of humility. You demanded compliance with rules that defied logic and law. You built a fortress of regulations. And in doing so, you starved your own kingdom. Arthur Jenkins then rose briefly, confirming the details of our ongoing lawsuit, the sheer scale of the damages sought, and the undeniable legal jeopardy the HOA and its president now faced. Brenda Carlucci's camera flash was relentless. The climax came when a resident, a mild-mannered accountant named Peterson, who had previously been one of Mildred's staunchest defenders, stood up. "Mildred," he said, his voice trembling slightly but firm. "We trusted you. I defended you. But this is a disaster. My wife couldn't get flour for 3 weeks. My children asked why the bakery was always closed. You did this to us. For what? So a tractor wouldn't spoil your view?" Mildred attempted a rebuttal, a rehash of her familiar excuses, outside agitators, procedural correctness, but her voice was thin, cracking. The crowd wasn't listening anymore. The visual of her, isolated and exposed under the harsh stage lights, her arguments falling on deaf ears, was the ultimate public embarrassment. The law enforcement presence was discreet but visible. A county sheriff leaned against the back wall, a silent testament to the gravity of the situation. The reckoning was complete. It wasn't loud or violent, but it was absolute. Her authority, built on a foundation of paper and petty power, had dissolved under the unblinking gaze of truth and the undeniable reality of empty grocery bags. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Within days of the town hall meeting, Mildred McMillan tendered her resignation as HOA president, effective immediately. The remaining board members, shaken and facing the very real threat of personal financial ruin from Arthur Jenkins' lawsuit, moved quickly to dissolve the existing HOA structure, opting for a far simpler, less intrusive neighborhood association with drastically curtailed powers. The ridiculous $400 fine was, of course, rescinded. My harvester, looking slightly weathered but fundamentally unharmed, was returned to my farm with a formal, written apology from the interim neighborhood committee and a check covering the estimated damages for its downtime and a token amount for inconvenience, a sum Arthur advised me to accept as a preliminary gesture, with the larger civil suit still pending to address the full scope of the commercial and emotional damages. We eventually settled that suit out of court for a substantial figure, enough to ensure Mildred McMillan would think twice before ever attempting to wield a rule book again, and enough to fund a significant upgrade to my farm's irrigation system and establish a college fund for Tom that would see him through any university he chose. The food supply to the newly chastened Creekwood neighborhood was gradually restored. I made no grand pronouncements, no triumphant declarations. I simply resumed my planting schedules, my delivery contracts. The Daily Need, now sourcing its flour directly from my freshly milled wheat under a new, more robust agreement, put up a sign, "Our signature sourdough is back," thanks to Henderson Farms. It was a small thing, but it spoke volumes. The local economy, subtly bruised by the disruption, began to recover. There was a cost, of course. The fight had taken a toll, not in treasure, but in time, in peace of mind. Sarah confessed she still felt a knot in her stomach whenever an unfamiliar car drove slowly past our laneway. Tom had asked difficult questions about why people would do such mean things. These were the invisible scars, the moral cost of engaging with such profound, malicious absurdity. But there was also a quiet satisfaction. My land, my farm, had been defended. The principle had been upheld. The porch light on our farmhouse, a simple beacon in the rural twilight, once again symbolized not just a welcome home, but a return to control, a quiet assertion of boundaries respected. The fence lines, once a point of contention, now stood as a clear, undisputed delineation of where their world ended and mine began. The locked gate at the end of my main drive, usually open during the day, now often remained closed, a subtle psychological barrier, a reminder of the peace that had been hard-won. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, standing on the edge of a field newly planted with next season's crops, the rows stretching out under a vast sky, I would think of Mildred. I didn't wish her ill, not anymore. I simply hoped she had learned that true authority doesn't come from a binder of bylaws, but from the earth, from honest labor, from the fundamental respect one owes to the land and to those who work it. My harvester, now clean and gleaming, sits ready for the next season, a symbol not of defiance, but of resilience, of the enduring power of growth over petty destruction. The blood has been washed away, only the bounty remains.